every single day, you have to carve out an hour to reflect. Don't do any work. Just reflect on what did I learn yesterday? How should that change my plan tomorrow? What have I learned from the last 2 weeks? Every day, take that time to reflect. Most people, if they do that, they'll come up with 100 ways to do something better than their idea from yesterday.
Kenan, welcome to Speed.
Great to be here.
I'd love to hear a little bit about the early story of Zipline and sort of your story leading up to that.
My career started in medical robotics and medical devices, and I sort of went from that into sort of a valley of disillusionment around like what that could mean for the world, and ended up going way deep on the product design side of that world. And then in grad school, sort of stumbled on a project that became sort of really impactful in open source and robotics called ROS. I spent 7 years of my life building that, funding that, getting that off the ground, created a foundation to oversee ROS, a robot operating system. And then took some time to really figure out what I wanted to do next. And knew I wanted something with a lot of impact, knew I wanted something that could really scale because I'd found sort of one but not the other and the other without the other. And I wanted to find the right co-founder. I think at that point in my career, I knew myself well enough to know what I was good at and what I wasn't good at. I needed to find the right partners for this adventure. And along that journey, I met my co-founders for Zipline, Keller and Ryan, and we really hit it off and explored a bunch of different things together, including Zipline. My wife's an epidemiologist. Keller's family is in public health as well. And they kept nudging us of like, hey, Amazon's talking about drone delivery, but like in the world of health, we keep hearing about these big health intervention campaigns that just get stuck on logistics. Can you go, maybe drones can solve that problem. And so we dug into that. I fully expected to learn 1,000 reasons why that would never work, right? I thought no supply, no willingness to pay, no willingness to adopt and change their supply chains. But the more we spent out in the world, and at the time, Costa Rica and Tanzania, it actually went the opposite direction. It just became clear that the supply was there. The intense political pressure to solve this problem was there. The willingness to hire us as a startup with a sketch deck was there. Yeah. And then the rest is history.
Amazing. And so what was that early process like? Like you met Keller and Ryan, was it?
Yeah. What was the process like? I knew I was looking for the right co-founders. They actually had another startup going at the time that was doing these little iPhone dock robots that you could like program as a kid and stuff. And they were sort of deciding, hey, should they make it into a consumer electronics brand, or should they sort of pivot to do something more impactful? And so we got introduced through a mutual friend and started exploring some of these other things that we thought could be really impactful, including this. And it was actually in front of the Minister of Health. So in Costa Rica, they have a public health system. Through a connection, we got an opportunity to pitch the executive board of this health system. So picture the executive boardroom like a U-shaped table. Everybody's got a microphone. Everybody's wearing suits. And Keller brushed up on his Spanish, and in Spanish, with 2 weeks head start, had that whole group wrapped around his finger around this vision for how to solve some really big challenges they had serving their indigenous population from a pharmacy and healthcare point of view. And that was the moment where I was like, all right, I thought this guy had some talent, but this is amazing. This is everything I've been looking for in a co-founder in terms of an ability to really bring people along for really aggressive vision. And Ryan, similarly on the product and technology side, just a ton of chemistry around how to solve problems, how to think about the customer from the very beginning, and how to move fast. And so that was the moment I knew it was like, all right, the customers desperately want these public health systems. I've got the co-founders that complement me the ways I knew I needed to be complimented in order to be successful. And I was ready to dive in.
And so was that early 2014?
Yeah. We started working together just casually end of 2013 and officially kicked off Zipline in February of 2014.
Cool. And so at that point, when you sort of officially kicked it off, had you talked to a bunch of these health systems, or it sounds like there was a lot of customer discovery that went into sort of identifying these core needs around delivering stuff. Exactly.
So at that point, we had talked to a few of them. I knew there was a lot more to go, but we had talked to enough of them that the pull was there. We had de-risked. So one of the biggest question in my mind was like supply. If we're going to go build a logistics system to deliver something that doesn't exist, it's like, great, I can deliver from A to B, but there's no supply at A. Well, you solve nothing. And so that was de-risked, and that and the pull was what I was really looking for. I mean, off of a sketch deck, within a few months, we were having meetings with presidents of countries. And that was a sign of like, whoa, okay, like this is a problem that people really want solved. And yeah, and all of my, again, I come at this with, I'm a huge skeptic. I'm the opposite of an early adopter. I love developing technology, but I love to use technology that just freaking works. And, and so I think that helps me a lot to kind of be that skeptic in the room, to ask those hard questions, to make sure we don't, spend a bunch of time on something no one actually is going to adopt or pay for or want.
Yeah. Well, one of the stories I heard from the early days of Zipline was the database of death. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
This was intense. So we met this grad student, had been studying this problem of basically just lack of access to medical supplies. And he had basically given cell phones to all these doctors and asked them to text them every time they knew what, they knew what treatment to provide, but they didn't have the supplies to provide that treatment.
And what was his goal in doing that? Like, it sounds kind of hopeless. Like,
yeah, he wanted to understand how big the problem was. This is the classic public health research problem of like, hey, there's this sense of a problem, right? Doctors are saying things. Can we put numbers to this to then put policy behind it? And yeah, he wanted to understand how big of a problem was this. And so over a couple of years, he had these text messages, and they were explaining what they were missing and what the outcome was. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, the outcome was death. And he's scrolling through just page after page after page of this spreadsheet. And it was sort of this very morbid moment of just understanding the gravity and the scale of this problem. And it was a big part of motivating us to dive in. It also really helped us understand why this is in so many of these countries that we started in, why this is literally a political problem. Like this raises to the level of issue that it's what the populace wants leaders to solve at like top priority for the country. And that was obviously really important because, we're very disruptive, right? In Silicon Valley, that is a loved word. In the world of public health and healthcare supply chains and healthcare operations, disruption is a terrible word. And that was one of the things I was really worried about, is like, will these health systems actually change the way they work and want to change and go through that upheaval that comes with change in order to make this, in order to adopt a technology like this? And that really helped us understand that they would.
Yeah. That's powerful. And was that sort of early 2014 that you had that moment?
Yeah. That database of death, I think, was right. Just 2 months into this, it was quite intense.
Yeah, got it. And so, in those early days, how did you think about product development? Did you sort of know that you were going to go with a fixed wing drone that was going to fly, X number of kilometers, or what was the sort of early product development?
What became clear and clear with the customer conversations when we were literally sitting with the logistics operators, with maps, looking at, where they needed deliveries and where they had supply locations, and really getting into the nuts and bolts of like, okay, how would this work? How are we going to hold inventory? How many orders per day are we talking about? It really became clear that there were like two things that mattered a ton, right? It needed to be a long range platform, range, and low cost. Those are the two things that were going to make this work. Yeah. And when you're talking about things that fly, compared to something that's, like a quadcopter drone, or even like an eVTOL with a wing and that can hover, a fixed wing is just about 5 times more efficient, right? Which basically means you can either fly 5 times farther for the same cost, or, fly for 5 times cheaper for the same range. And that's a big deal. 5X is a big X factor. And when it comes to actually making the product market fit, the economics of this work for the customer. And so it was one of those things where it was just like, it became clear it was going to be the only option, right? Basically, it was sort of saying, hey, in order to make this work, we're going to have to figure out how to deliver with a fixed wing vehicle, how to launch, how to recover, if we want to make a product experience that's going to work well. It was kind of bonkers. I literally had one investor who was just for 2 years, like, you've got to do VTOL. You've got to do VTOL. You've got to do VTOL. The industry is doing vertical takeoff and landing. You've got to do it too. Why are you doing fixed wing? This is crazy. And it's like, look, this is what, we understand the customer well. That gives us the conviction to take this, counterintuitive bet. And then luckily, once we started operating, like the rest is history, right? It was just, no one questioned it once they saw it work, which was great because, obviously we could have been wrong.
Yeah. Well, one thing Paul mentioned was that there was sort of a couple of weeks where you were sort of making this call between eVTOL and this sort of fixed wing, I don't know if you call it like a slingshot or like a giant rubber band architecture. Yep. But what was sort of that process like? And when was that roughly? Right
off the bat, we were trying to really understand the trade between something like that was eVTOL versus fixed wing. I'm doing technology development. I'm inherently optimistic. Some people are telling me, oh, it's going to be 5X. 5x worse. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, like let's look at this carefully and make sure it's actually that big of a delta, this kind of thing. And the more we got into it, the clearer it was that it was a big delta. In the very early days, we thought, we needed like a 20-kilometer range to really make this a really great product. And when we're working back and forth with these customers in detail, it's just clear 20 kilometers was effectively useless, right? To cover a country that with 20-kilometer circles, it's so many circles. So the overhead of the logistics of each of those operating centers is just debilitating from a economics point of view and a scalability point of view. You're talking about replicating supply all over the place. You're not necessarily making the problem the problem at hand, which is how do you consolidate supply in one location and then deliver it where it's actually, when it's needed, when you know exactly what's needed and where it's needed. And guess requires a lot of, results in a lot of waste and you have to have a whole bunch of extra supply in the system these countries can't afford. And so it really just became clear that look, okay, 20-kilometer circle is not going to work. 80-kilometer circle is what really matters. And as that crystallized, that's also when it was like, all right, a VTOL vehicle is going to be so big and expensive. There's just no way, right? We can make the economics close for this customer. And that's where that conviction just landed of really, it's just sort of letting yourself I always like to think of these things as like, you just, you assume you know nothing and you assume you're wrong about everything and just go learn as fast as you can, ideally from your customers, and don't imagine anything about your customers. That's my life lesson. The second you imagine something about your customers, you're just wrong. And if you base your design on that imagination, you go off the rails and design a solution to an imaginary problem. And that's a waste of a lifetime. So.
Right. And so when was that you made that call that you're like, okay, like eVTOL definitely
it was
not the
pretty
answer?
Quick. I'd say it was like mid 2014. Yeah, it was pretty quick.
So sort of a few months in. You kind of
a few months in, yeah.
Yeah, got it.
We had done some prototyping with VTOL. We had done some prototyping because one of the big questions was, could we actually deliver from a fixed wing in a way that people would like? And so we took some prototypes on some customer visits and hooked them over the fence of these different ways of absorbing the package. That took a little iteration. Originally, we thought it needed to look like a sleeping bag, just pad the package like a sleeping bag kind of in a stuff sack. But that would hit the ground with this kind of thud that would startle everybody. And it was just really obvious that wasn't going to work. And so it kind of went from there like, all right, I have to do this parachute. Is that going to be economical? There's a lot of testing with paper parachutes. We're like, all right, that can work, and tested that with customers. They're like, yeah, that's fine. Great. Do that. And they're like, okay, well, maybe this isn't as hard as we thought it was going to be. So,
So were you flying back and forth at the time? Because your main HQ is sort of in the Bay, right? In Half Moon Bay?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is, when I think about speed too, our HQ is like a huge unlock for our speed. So the other thing we were doing those first 6 months of the company was trying to find a headquarters that would also be our test site. And we found a place where we could have, prototyping facility, the entire company and our test site, like all within 50 feet of each other. And that was a huge thing for speed. Everything was really tightly connected. Now, obviously, we'd love to do that at an actual customer site, but given the nature of the safety concerns of what we do, that we just, despite our attempts at creativity, we couldn't come up with a way to do that. But this was hugely empowering. And then, a bunch of us were spending a ton of time in Central America and in Africa, just sort of constantly.
What was the attempt at creativity? Is there like you tried to get a government to let you prototype there, and they were just like, no way, this is completely.
We were looking for okay, maybe there's an area in one of these countries we could test in that could then become our first operating base. And we were convinced our speed of hardware iteration was going to be too slow, just based on how hard, just on logistics and supply chain availability of prototype components and things in a lot of these countries that we're talking to. That was one big challenge. And we were also, the other big reason was we were just worried about our ability to hire. And so this was kind of splitting the difference. This was already a good hiring filter for people who care about your mission, because we were literally in the middle of a cattle ranch, in the middle of nowhere, kind of outside Silicon Valley, and beautiful, best views of the ocean you're ever going to have. But the kind of thing that if you're used to a nice cushy Google life, you may look at this and be like, I don't know if this is for me. And of course, that was a great thing to filter out with a test site like that. So it was sort of the best of both worlds to consolidate the whole team in the middle of this cattle ranch, and then of course just travel a lot to our customer sites. As you can imagine too, with our customer sites, we didn't have contracts at this point, right? These were in early conversations. A government contract is who we didn't know at that time, but we now know takes years to actually get sign on the dotted line. So we were not just doing this basically product discovery work to really understand what the product needed to be. We were also trying to sell this thing and actually get through all the myriad of hoops to actually get a government contract, which basically meant we had to have boots on the ground a lot to build the relationships and get all that to happen.
And so sort of like mid 2014, you picked this architecture. And at the time, did you realize that you were going to have a giant sort of rubber band that was going to shoot this thing off and then have some sort of catcher mechanism?
It was an interesting series of bets because it was the launching piece of it, the catapult, that I wasn't too worried about. That was sort of like, all right, that's, a reasonably scaled version of that's been done in the military. Like we can kind of like ride that wave. And our early prototypes there were pneumatic, like the military ones. There's a lot of reasons why that's not scalable. Well, not the least of which, when they go off, it sounds like an explosion going off, which of course you don't want to happen every few minutes around a team of operators. The landing side though, that's where my worry was, because there was no one had ever come up with a scalable way to land fixed wing drones in all weather. Right? If you have a big runway and the weather's not too bad, you can land a drone. If you have a giant net, you can land a drone, but it's not scalable, right? When you land a drone in a net, it's it gets tangled, and the turnaround time is measured in hours, not minutes, for landing that way. And basically the way we kind of bifurcated, took a tech bet and said, okay, the main team's going to work on the plane, because the plane that stays in the air and makes the deliveries, that's what the customer cares about. They actually don't care that much that you land. They care that you launch and deliver. And after that, it's sort of up to you, as we joke. And it was like, and then in parallel created an entirely independent tech development path to figure out how to land these planes reliably. And that was an adventure all by itself. Yeah.
And so was this sort of second half of 2014, you were experimenting with these different landing techniques?
Into 2015 for sure. Like I'd say the landing, we were experimenting with landing way to the end of 2015. How to land was like the last thing we figured out how to do scalably. I kid you not. The system that we shipped for our first operations in Rwanda involved a giant bouncy castle mat custom made by a bouncy castle company, and 2 deep sea fishing poles, like off the shelf with fishing reels. That was part of the bill of materials for the landing system that we launched this service with. And we could land every like 5-10 minutes with that system. So it was better than anything else that had been done before. But compared to what we do today, where we land every 40 seconds, it was still early in that iteration process.
Yeah. And so how many, were there sort of a bunch of prototypes that led up to the fishing pole prototype, or?
Oh yeah. We tried everything we could think of. The simplest thing we tried, which I was really excited about, and I was so disappointed it didn't work, was we basically tried to make a mat. This kind of, we call it the stunt person mat, right? So the things stunt people jump off onto, and it kind of just poofs onto this huge mat. We thought that was the way to land. There were sort of 2 fundamental problems with that. One is those mats are huge to make that to get the energy, basically the impact energy on your drone low enough. The mat has to be unbelievably huge, and it has to be very lightweight material, because it turns out if the material is thick and durable, then it's sort of like belly flopping onto water, right? It's like it really smacks your drone, and the impact loads that just break things. And so you have to have really thin material, which makes it really fragile, which of course isn't good for having something outside for a long time. There was a moment. So one of the prototypes we made there, also made for us by a bouncy castle company, was a 30-foot tall pyramid, 60 feet wide on the base. So angled on the sides. So we thought we were going to like basically come in and kind of belly flop onto the sides of the pyramid. And we made this prototype. And, we rigged up one of our launchers into a high lift to launch these plywood we call them super chickens. We made these, at the time we only had a couple flying prototypes, so we definitely weren't going to risk those on a landing test, right? So we made these things out of plywood and 2x4s that were the size of the plane and the weight of the plane that we'd launch off the launcher on a high lift at this pyramid. And we're doing this testing, and then the wind picks up. And it turns out, despite having, 5-foot long stakes used to hold down like a party tent, a giant pyramid of this shape, when the wind really picks up, has an amazing amount of lift. And this thing just ripped the stakes out and just goes flying. I mean, like it went, a couple hundred yards downwind. And the whole company ran out of the building to try to tackle this thing and try to deflate this thing before it went too far. And needless to say, well, that was one reason we didn't like the pyramid. We could not get that belly flop impact load low enough to the point where it would be reliably gentle on the aircraft. Because that's a lot of where this comes from is, basically landings dictate the life of an aircraft, right? You can design an aircraft to fly if basically forever from a weather perspective, turbulence, storms. That's very straightforward. But hard landings, that determines the life of an aircraft. And we knew we had to make these aircraft last a really, really long time in order to make the economics work really well. So this was like, okay, how do you make it reliably gentle, right? 5 nines reliable, that kind of thing. And that was the nut we were trying to crack. And so having this like 50G slap when you landed on this pyramid, that wasn't going to work. That was one of my favorite prototypes that I was so optimistic about solving. And the deeper we got into it, the deeper it was clearly a dead end. And we tried a half a dozen things like that. Things where it's like, all right, what's the simplest thing we could possibly come up with? And one of those ideas led to how we land today. This basically one of the mechanical engineers had this idea of taking 2 pole vaulting poles, right? Imagine a pole vaulting pole. If you ever held one, these are very stiff. I know when you watch a pole vault go, they look pretty flimsy, but like take a pole vaulting pole and bend it in a U shape. So it's like a crazy tension spring. And then attach a line between the ends of the poles, let go, release the pole vaulting poles so they spring up. That line goes flying straight up in the air and would hit the bottom of the plane and slide it back into a tail hook. That was the idea of this concept. And now the reason you want the line going up really fast is when a plane's coming into land in really crazy weather, it's bouncing all over the place, right? So it's jumping up and down at the last second. But if the line goes up fast enough, it doesn't matter how much the drone is bouncing up and down because it'll still hit the bottom of the plane and slide back into the tail hook. And so we built a prototype of this. It was terrifying, but it worked really well. It was like, and then it was like, all right, take a step back because we're not going to make these giant, lethal mouse traps, which is basically what these pole vaulting poles bent into a U shape looked like and how they felt when they went off. It's like, all right, how do we make a safe version of that's, easy to reset and do over and over again? And that's what led us to the recovery system we ended up with.
How big was the team when you were iterating over these different landing systems?
Oh, tiny. The whole engineering team. When we shipped the first version of the whole system, it was probably the engineering team was maybe 15 people. And that's everything. That's aero and embedded and flight software and UIs and mechanical, electrical, the whole thing. So we were prototyping with just a couple folks on each of these projects.
Yeah, got it. And so would you sort of parallelize it? Would you say, okay, we don't know which one of these landing systems is going to work, which architecture is going to work, so we're going to have a couple people work on each one? Or did you sort of like have everybody working on, sort of serially?
No, so basically the whole engineering team was focused on a plane that would stay in the sky in storms. For the first year, I just treated it as my hobby project. I was like, all right, we're just going to keep experimenting, and had a couple interns helping out along the way, which was awesome as we tried these different ideas. Again, because it was sort of like, all right, hey, landing, we will figure that out, and it may not be that scalable when we launch, but like what we have to have when we launch is a drone that stays in the air, right? That's the most important thing. So the core team was focused on that. So at any given time, just a few of us in a very serial fashion working on these different prototypes, just largely to keep the resources focused on nailing the reliability of the aircraft. Because that was the like go home, don't pass go. Because if we launched the service and the drones are falling out of the sky, we knew that was we knew that was the end of the company. So we really had to get that done. And then of course, once we got to the point where we had this fishing pole solution with a giant tail hook that would drop down from the plane, then it was like, okay, we can launch with that. Like at least we have something we can launch with. And that became the norm. It's like, all right, so we think we have a path in the long run to get away from that, get rid of the deployable tail hook that was 1.5 meters long that would deploy the whole plane. Then it was like, all right, so now we've de-risked this enough to with the money we had to get the first, system into the field with customers, which of course was, at that point our obsession because our customers wanted it, as soon as they decided they were going to buy it, they wanted it, right? You had asked me about speed, and I think the speed is just, I'll tell you one of the most motivating things that we had, which is this connection to our customers. Literally, we had a minister of health sending us pictures of people who had passed away and literally saying, hey, like, it's time for you guys to get this done because, there are people dying and these are some of the people. And there is nothing that focuses a team, rallies the team around what matters, what actually matters and what you can actually cut than that connection to a customer. Like it was magical for speed and focus. And there was no, the way I like to describe it is like, to me, a company doesn't have that connection. They're having these academic debates about like, I like this technology better than that technology and this architecture better than that architecture.
That's
and for us, it's like right? None of that. It's like, what matters to the customer? What is the simplest minimum thing that will get this done? Any academic debates, people would look at them like they were crazy of like, why does that matter? Like we have a customer who wants this right now and needs this yesterday. That's what matters. So let's focus on the right decision in that context.
Yeah. And so when did you launch the first, landing station plus delivery setup?
So the evolution in production of landing systems. So when we launched in Rwanda, we had a 60-foot long bouncy castle mat with 2 fishing poles at the end. That was our primary launch system. And then we had a prototype because it was just barely working of sort of the next iteration. And the next iteration, we got rid of the fishing poles, which was great because the fishing poles was a nightmare to reset. If you've ever used a fishing reel and you sort of reel a fish in wrong, and then the next fish pulls really hard, like it'll jam up and stuff like that. We literally had those problems, which would rip planes in half and things. So it was not good. So we had a system that was moving away from the fishing poles. And so this actually used like custom made carbon poles with big motors instead of fishing reels so that we could like automatically reel the plane out, set the plane down precisely on a mat instead of it just whizzing out and randomly hitting a mat that's anywhere on a 60-foot long mat. And so we had both of those set up when we first launched in Rwanda. The thing that we knew worked and the thing that we were trying to make work better. Yeah, and then it was probably about 9 months later that the next big iteration came, which actually got rid of the deployable tailhook, which was very exciting, got rid of the mats altogether, and it's what you see us operating on at scale today.
Cool. And so when was the first, you sort of start iterating on this in like early 2014, 2015, you're like, working on a couple different parts of the system. And then when did you ship that early prototype to Rwanda?
Yeah. So we shipped that prototype, and basically it was like 3 weeks before the president of Rwanda wanted to do a launch event. And one of our partners, UPS, we called them up and said, "Hey, can you help us?" And they said, "How can we help?" And we're like, "Do you by any chance have a large aircraft that can like come to California, pick up one of our whole systems, fly it straight to Rwanda, and we can set it up?" And they're like, "Yeah, no problem." And we're like, "Oh, I'm glad we asked." And so we literally set up a whole system, all the aircraft, recovery system, launchers, everything. We had something like 30 crates set up around our cattle ranch that we were packing, hoping it wouldn't rain. And and then those all got put onto a 747 and flown straight to Rwanda. And then that launch event was end of 2016 that we set it up in Rwanda and launched the service.
It sounds like there was this
2 years.
This like really long period of prototyping between sort of first deciding that, this architecture was going to work in 2014 and then actually shipping at the end of 2016. It sounds like a lot of that prototyping was around the landing system. Of course, a lot of it was around the actual aircraft. Like how many sort of prototypes do you think you built in that time? Was this like sort of tens of aircraft? Is it like 100 aircraft? Like what's the scale there?
There were 6 major iterations of the aircraft in that time frame. And there are obviously many more minor iterations of those aircraft. So some of these iterations were focused on enabling like our avionics team to start flying and get experience as early as possible. Later iterations were about dialing in the aerodynamic performance, dialing in the performance in bad weather, dialing in fault tolerance. Fault tolerance is one of those things that's way harder to do than I thought. Early in my career, I worked on medical robotics where you talk about fail safe, right? So basically it can fail, it just can't hurt the patient. Mm-hmm. But fail operative, I'm thinking in my head, that sounds, that's got to be just a little bit harder. A smidge harder than that. And it turns out fail operative versus fail safe is like 10x harder. Because now you're talking about things that fail and the thing just needs to keep working as if nothing had failed. And there was a lot of iteration around that, trying to take a lot of the fail operative design concepts have been developed in the world of aviation and aerospace, but they're literally like, refrigerator size avionics systems in 747s that do that. And so of course our avionics can only weigh a couple hundred grams, right? It needs to fit in the palm of your hand. And so it's like, okay, what is the right translation here? How do we achieve the level of safety and reliability we need for the service to work in our drone size, in our economic footprint? And that there was a lot of iteration at that level.
Did you have sort of like a clear spec that you were like, okay, we're doing these iterations towards this perfect spec of, it has to like fly, it has to have a parachute so that if it, breaks in the air, it will gently fall to the ground. The launcher has to work every time. The catcher has to work 80% of the time. Were those clear numbers at the beginning, or was it just sort of like, let's keep experimenting until it seems good enough?
It was a little bit of both. We were flying as much as we possibly could on our prototype. So over those 6 generations, we would build more and more of each generation. So at the beginning, we'd build just 2 or 3. And by the end, it was more like 6 or even 12 copies. And we were just flying them like a bunch in the air at the same time at our test site, all weather, whatever we could get, whatever stressing situation we could come up with. We call that flushing out the unknowns, right? Like there's all the stuff we knew to worry about and then, or we thought we should worry about. And then this was really validating that, as well as flushing out things that surprised us. And so there were things where like, oh, we definitely have to have redundant of these systems, right? And it turns out we didn't. But other systems where it's like, oh, we didn't think we needed that. No, we're missing. And so that was really informative. We also went out and tried to learn from others as much as possible. Spent a bunch of time with the U.S. military, who's the largest operator of drones in the world back then. And they had a team that was trying to really understand how they were losing drones. And they lose a lot. They lose a disappointing number of drones for how much those drones cost, and for tax dollars it works reasons. But they shared with us this awesome list. They had basically a rank ordered list of their failure modes, and some of them were easy for us. Right, top of their list is gas engine problems. We're like, okay, cool, electric, check. They also had problems with how do you architect the system? Right, a lot of their systems require communications to be up, and they lost a phenomenal amount of drones because of that. And so we made sure to build a system where loss of comms did not was very unlikely to result in a safety incident or a loss of a drone. And so there are design principles like that came from their to-do list that were really, really, really informative. And we talked to anybody in the world who was operating drones at any scale who would get on the phone with us. We're like, okay, cool. What have you learned? Like, what are all the failure modes you have to worry about? How often does this happen? And we use that information to not only rank order our efforts, but also try to baseline. Working with the regulators in these countries, we knew what we were targeting in terms of we call it parachute landing rate. As you mentioned, we have a parachute on the aircraft, very important for speeding up development, right? So you can test and iterate it, and you don't just have piles of dust at your test site.
How did you pick that parachute landing rate? That sounds like incredibly hard to sort of like 10% or like 1%. Like how did that come about?
In the early days, it was negotiated with the regulator, and it was literally sort of a like, what are you comfortable with? What are we comfortable with? Kind of conversation. We knew obviously the parachute landings, we knew that would affect our economics because going to retrieve aircraft is expensive. We knew if there's a critical delivery on that aircraft, we knew that could be life threatening. So that was pushing the number up to levels that we thought would be really acceptable. There was a lot of academic research on sort of the safety side of this, right? Basically, how often might a parachute landing lead to a safety incident on the ground? We basically looked at all the reasons this number, all the floors on this number, right? How often you'd paraland because you wouldn't get an order through. We're like, okay, that needs to be really high for this reason. For safety for people on the ground, the parachute landing rate needs to be high for this other reason. And then working with the regulator, similar conversations, because they want to make sure this is sort of safe and responsible. The nice thing about this ultra focus in the early days on literal life-saving use cases, the estimate of the life-saving ratio of our early flights was somewhere between 1 in 3 flights to save a life and 1 in 10 flights to save a life. So if you talk about the risk of fatalities from a flight being in the order of like 1 in thousands or 1 in tens of thousands, that's sort of an obvious value.
Wow, what a comparison! Yeah,
exactly, and that was really powerful for having these regulatory conversations and making sure those were grounded in an overall understanding of what this service was doing, and that's how we got started.
2.5 years seems like kind of a long time. It's especially because I heard that you have sort of never actually had a non-parachute failure landing in Rwanda. Anytime a Zip has failed in the air, it always parachutes and always sort of successfully, lands smoothly. I guess, could you have sort of shipped earlier or in retrospect?
I would say no. Like, getting our safety to the point where we were comfortable with it was the gate to shipping, right? And by the way, having a parachute landing system that is as reliable as you just said, that took a lot of that time. I am convinced as a company, Zipline has spent more resources, more money, more team time on developing, testing, and hardening our parachute landing system than many other drone delivery startups have spent in their entire budget. It is insanely hard to make a system like that never fails, right? It's not just about not failing in theory, right? This is a parachute that today can be on an aircraft for like a couple of years without deploying. And after those couple of years of being in harsh environments, in rainstorms, that parachute still needs to just work. The amount of testing it takes, the amount of validation it takes to get all that long tail of details on the design worked out and on the supply chain worked out and the manufacturing quality control worked out and the operational process and design for operations, design for field service and all dialed. Yeah, it's a lot just on that one system. And we did a lot of testing on that system before we launched this service because one of the main reasons is we were bracing for surprises, right? We met somebody in the safety aviation space who gave us this basically stern talking to of like, you guys are going to go do something no one else has done before. We're like, what do you mean? Nobody flies in storms near the ground. Like, that's just not done. Like, at all. And I'm like, well, what about medevac helicopters? And they're like, no, they stopped doing that 20 years ago. It's too dangerous. And we're like, oh, really? What this guy was telling us was like, look, the history of aviation, when you do something new like you're about to do, you're gonna flush out things nobody saw coming, right? You're gonna experience things that no expert has seen before. Having a parachute that's rock solid means that those tough lessons learned, we safety optimize as opposed to risk for people on the ground. So we took that really seriously. So getting the aircraft to the right level of safety was hard. Getting the parachute to get to the level it's achieved was harder.
Zooming out in a minute, one of the talks you gave had this incredible chart of the number of different users. And it sort of initially had, I think it was 5 users, and then it sort of expanded to like the 30 subtypes of user. When you think about your connection to users and speed, what sort of ideas come to mind?
In the world of tough tech like this, where you have really complicated technology, I meet just way too many founders who basically say, oh, I don't need to worry about users because I got to worry about technology for the next few years. I might have thought that way too in starting this. It didn't happen that way for a lot of reasons, some of which was my training, some of which was my paranoia and other people on the team's paranoia and things like that. But I am so glad we were obsessed with users from the beginning. It's sort of like the magic ingredient for a startup, right? In speed of every type, right? There's engineering speed, which is really important, but there's also all the other speed. How easy is it to fundraise? How easy is it to get customers? All these other things. And it turns out if you're really customer obsessed and you get to know real customers early in your design process, that helps you actually get real customers that are going to buy later, which of course, investors love customers, right? Keep telling people this, like, if you want to raise money, the easiest way to do it is have like customers who are going to get on the phone with those investors and tell them how excited they are to pay for this, as well as recruit the right team members, right? The best engineers in the world, they want to work on something that's going to ship, that's going to impact people, that's going to make a big difference. Zipline's been able to hire just the best of the best across so many engineering disciplines. And so much of that has been because they've been somewhere that wasn't customer obsessed, that wasn't customer driven or customer led. And they see it. They see the energy in the room. They see the focus on the customer. They see the pragmatism that comes from, again, not debating the academically what's technically smarter, but like what matters to the customer, and having all your product decisions and technical decisions based there just means you get to move faster, and that attracts the best talent. So everything that's hard about a startup is easier when you're customer led. And of course, the biggest thing is like the journey of a startup is, right, it's this sort of credibility march. You get a little bit of money, and then you got to use that to like advance the company as much as you can. And, like I'm always telling my team members, if you're imagining what matters, you're just going to get in trouble. Right? You've got to be not imagining it. You need to be grounded in what matters to your customers. And if you are, and you use that to really focus yourself and focus to drive your priorities in everything you do, you can just move lightning fast. And of course, that radically de-risks the chances you make progress that gets you the next round of funding and the next customer.
Right. And so I guess when you think about customers, there's obviously the folks who pay you. And then there's also sort of regulatory bodies and other, people who are sort of stakeholders in this that aren't paying you. But it seemed like you sort of wove those people's needs into the product and into the service in a pretty guided or deterministic way.
Yeah. Every human being who's going to be involved in your journey, right, can either be an accelerant or the opposite, right? They can either put the brakes on for you, or they can be an accelerant. And when you're a drone system like this, is obviously the regulators, it's a whole bunch of people with a whole bunch of concerns. And then of course you have your actual people, like for us, the people placing our orders, right? They have a whole bunch of concerns and challenges. There's the customers who hire us, right? The people who actually want us to do on-demand delivery day in and day out. They have a totally different set of needs. We have our operators who run and maintain these aircraft. Right. Every time we went deep in the early days, where it was like, okay, hey, I've got just as an offhand, one of our investors who comes from aerospace, who Paul Willard, he's like, look, I'm going to introduce you some people in this space who introduce some folks on the maintenance side of the equation who we didn't know anything about aircraft maintenance, and having that conversation with an aircraft maintenance expert of like what that journey is for them. At the beginning, it was like a big wake-up call of like, whoa, okay. Having someone clearly explain to you, why do aircraft get maintained all the time and your car doesn't, in a way that like was really tangible in the weeds, all of a sudden was a wake-up call of like, whoa, if we don't design for this from the beginning, just the maintenance costs, will completely kill the economics of this. And so that was, that put at the top of our list. We have to make something that is just trivial to maintain. In a system like this, if we didn't design from the beginning, it would not have been physically possible, right? Trivial to maintain means like very modular, and it means each module is independently waterproof, and each module is tested at the factory in a way that when you integrate it, that plus a pre-flight check, it just flies. You have to be very intentional with every little detail of the design to have that modularity not kill your structural efficiency, or to have the electronics designed in such a way where the electronics can diagnose itself to the module level. So the person in the field doesn't have to root cause and troubleshoot. The system says, hey, replace my right, outboard wing section. And you just swap that and then it's done. Right.
Right.
At the end of the day, it's not that hard to design for those things if you do it from the beginning. But if you come in late where you like forgot about a user category, and any one of these users, maintenance, operators, delivery recipients, the shippers, we call them shippers, the people that we partner with on the supply chain upstream side, the regulators, even the export compliance. I mean, you name it. There's so many layers to this. If we didn't design for their worlds from the beginning, any one of those could have been a 1 to 2 year reset, which for a hardware startup is hard to survive.
It seems sort of obvious when you describe it this way, but there's obviously a trade-off in complexity, right? Like if each of those users has 5 needs and you've got 30 users, suddenly you have 150, this giant list of user needs. Did you have a tool for sort of slimming that down? Did you have sort of subsections for different teams of different, Google Sheets with like lists of user needs, or did you have one giant list where you sort of try to prioritize them?
We do the classic thing, right? We have basically a feature ledger, a risk ledger, and a plan, right? And the risk ledger and the feature ledger, that's where all of these details go. Right? A user challenge can be a risk. It can be like, hey, export compliance says a drone that flies this far is a cruise missile. If we don't find a way around that, we can't send these anywhere outside the United States. So that's a big risk, a huge risk, a risk that like would kill the company kind of risk. So that works its way to the top of the risk ledger. Similarly, on the feature side, there's certain things on the regulatory side that we put on that list. And some of those things, especially when we do something new for us, some of the things we put on the regulatory list, right, they were guesses. Right. Zipline still is working with regulators to write these regulations. There's no established standard or regulations for what we do. So you have to work with the regulators, kind of guess where the hockey puck is going, or whatever metaphor you like, and then write it down and go. And right, to be clear, we were right about maybe 90% of that stuff. We were definitely wrong about at least 10% of it. But you try to be as right as you can and then sort of iterate, like deal with it with iteration. That's half the story. The other half of the story is just hiring unbelievably great design engineers, right? Like who could actually get their head around that much complexity and come up with simple solutions. Because if you don't have unbelievably great design engineers, that trying to design for that many users with that much complex needs, you'll end up with just a tarball of a system that like doesn't actually close and isn't easy. Great people. And then I think the last ingredient there is iteration. You got to give the team time to iterate. Like there's just nobody can come up with a first pass design that's elegant across that much complexity. And so we spent a lot of time just iterating and iterating and iterating and iterating. And of course, iterate where it's cheap, right? Ideally on the whiteboard, ideally, at the sketch level, ideally at the super chicken level, right? The plywood and prototype level where you can literally iterate many times per day, even on some of these concepts.
How many super chickens do you think you built over the early couple of years?
Hundreds of super chickens. Oh, hundreds of many different types, right? Some were specifically designed to enable launcher testing. Some were specifically designed for recoveries testing. We built super chickens specifically designed to enable us to like mock out the turnaround process of a vehicle from landing to the next flight to iterate on the ergonomics of that. When we originally were like, oh, you carry an aircraft around, like we just couldn't do that quickly without banging the aircraft on things, right? Like it was bad. So like, okay, so how are we going to do this? So we did a lot of iterating. I mean, hundreds of these prototypes.
So you had like a super chicken factory on the farm.
Oh yeah. We ordered so much 1/4-inch plywood and 2x4s that we opened up like a
wholesale contract
with a local lumber yard. And they would deliver it to us every week or two, like a truckload of plywood and 2x4s. And the guy would always joke because he never got, there was no building being built. He's like, what are you guys doing with all this building supplies?
That's absurd. Wow. What a story. Well, you mentioned hiring a few times and hiring amazing people. Obviously, there's sort of hiring for engineering excellence. There's hiring for, a particular sort of spike you mentioned, which is this, kind of ability to deal with a lot of complexity. When you think about hiring for speed, what sort of ideas come to mind and ways of screening people?
My answer to this question is going to be complicated. So I'll try to just pick a few pieces of the puzzle, but I don't want to pretend this is easier than it is because it is hard. The first thing we found is a very particular value that we interview for. And I like to describe this value as like the type of personality that is going to be fun when things are hard, right? Fun to work with when things are hard, right? And I like to explain this to people of sort of, we've all been on vacations with friends, right? All those vacations go off the rails at some point, right? But the best vacations we've ever had are with those friends. When it goes off the rails, you have the time of your life, right? And then of course there's the other friend or other relationship where it goes off the rails and you need space, you need some distance from each other. Maybe you don't do any more vacations together because and we really try to look for people in that first category. People where, a startup like this is just one challenge after another. And in order for this to be fun, right, you have to be the kind of personality where you're going to light up at the challenge. You're not going to be demoralized by it. You're not going to be discouraged by it. Those surprises that are challenges, you're not going to be, annoyed that your plan went off the rails, right? You're going to be the opposite. You're going to light up. You're going to have fun. You're going to be the person someone actually wants to go through that adventure with. I think that's the first thing, because
how do you actually interview for that? Like, I guess there's sort of this intuitive sense. Is that largely it? Or do you have any questions that you use to?
All kinds of questions and reference checks. Some of the times we'll probe at their professional experience first, right? So what are the places where you ask questions of hey, so tell me about a time when, you got surprised on your last project and what happened? And if it's a boring surprise, I'll be like, okay, what was the biggest surprise that ever happened to you in a project you've been on? Right. And then ask them to tell us about that experience. Right. And you can just tell by how they answer that question, right? If they light up and they were excited and then you could tell they rallied around the problem and got it solved, you found someone that you want to work with through a hard problem. If they're like, oh yeah, God, it was I had to go home and sleep. And then I, came in the next morning a little less grumpy and and I had to make a new plan and that was really annoying. And if it's a negative experience for them, then you don't have the right person, right? I'll probe there. We'll ask references this, right? Of hey, tell me about a time when this person was faced with a really hard, unexpected problem. What did they do? How did they treat their teammates? Is this somebody, based on how that went, does anybody want to work with them on another hard problem? These kinds of questions in a reference check go a long way. All hiring for this kind of company requires a ton of patience, right? This is just one of the criteria we try to screen on. And there's many others, like you mentioned, obviously the technical things included. You're going to have to go through a lot of folks to find the right sort of temperament, skill set, even life stage, right? There's times in my life that I've had, where personal health related, where I couldn't have done something like this. It was just takes too much commitment, too much energy, too much just hopping on a plane with no notice, this kind of thing. So you got to find the person who's really looking for that kind of a job. It's a different kind of job than, I'm always encouraging people, hey, if you're looking for a nice cushy, 9-to-5 job, I'll write you a great recommendation, but please don't work at Zipline, because Zipline is one challenge after another and you got to love it. Otherwise you'll hate it. So that's one thing. Yeah. Want to look for people who are inherently impatient, which is something that's tricky because you also want people that are positive to be around, and some inherently impatient people are awful to be around. And that inherent impatience manifests in their work, right? So those inherently impatient people, the signals you look for often are, basically what do they do, right? What have they done? And sometimes it's work, sometimes it's for hobbies, sometimes it's for, what they do with their family, right? I meet people who are like, wait a minute, you have the hard job and you're, taking your kids to their ski thing every weekend, all winter long. Whoa, you're able to do more in a human life sort of span than most people can. And so we look for that. Sometimes it's doing their hobby for fun, right? The first engineer we hired at Zipline, who's still here today and our chief avionics architect, he does solo sailboat racing using his own autopilot. So he would make his own autopilot system to steer the boat, basically. And it was okay, that's what you do for fun. And his day job was building some of the most complex medical diagnostic equipment in the world. And yeah, and he was like, okay, this is a good match here. This is someone who just gets things done, right? They're not somebody who is sort of stymied by challenge, and also someone who just lights up on ooh, I want to try that, I want to do that. I think beyond that, it's about a lot of what I'll interview for is how quickly somebody can take an idea they had and roll it back to first principles and find a fast way to de-risk it. A lot of people are like, I have an idea, I'm going to prototype it, it's going to take me 2 weeks, and they just go, right? The person who really thrives, they say, I have an idea and I could prototype it and it'll take me 2 weeks. And they're like, 2 weeks is a long time. How can I answer this question in less than 2 weeks or 2 hours maybe, right? And then they're like, oh, I have an idea. And they're off to the shop and boom, they do something and they come back with something 2 hours later. And it's people who are always sort of kind of iterating in their head on what is the simpler way to do it? What's the cheaper way to do it?
How do you interview for that? Because you're asking folks to do that in retrospect can be hard because they're sort of rewinding and...
I always do it live, right? So this is always a practical problem where I'll come in with a problem that's maybe real to Zipline, but usually a contrived problem of all right, hey, here's the design problem. How do we get into it, right? And spend a little time brainstorming. Then I'll ask them a question of okay, what's your first step here, right? Obviously, I'm looking to see that their first step is a smart way to de-risk that problem. This is where we're going to get a little more wonky here, but The other thing I look for is I look for people who solving hard technical system design problems, which is most of my career. There's an order of attack that you have to take, which is you have to start with trying to make the simplest possible solution to the hardest part of the problem. And then you work on the simplest solution to the next hardest part of the problem and so on. And most people go the other way. Most people are like, well, let me work on the easy part of the problem first. Totally wrong. Totally wrong. Now, what I just described is not always linear, by the way. A lot of times you're going down, you're starting trying to find the simplest solution to the hardest part of the problem, and you work your way down and you get to a dead end. You kind of have to go back to the beginning and iterate a bit.
Double check it works on the easy parts too, and then it might not.
Yeah.
And then you sort of.
And it might not, exactly. But you learned a lot that now informs the next time through it and the next time through it. And then eventually you get somewhere where you get to the end. But so many people, they go right to the easy part. Okay, back to this interview example. So you start by asking these questions. You start with this prompt of saying, hey, let's go through this mock problem together. Ask the question of where would you start, right? And I'm looking for that intuition to start in the right part of the problem. And then I ask practically, okay, cool. So how are you going to de-risk that? How are you going to learn from that? What's your first step? And obviously depends on the problem. Sometimes it's like, cool, I'm going to go take a prototype to a customer. And then I'll ask okay, what prototype and on what time frame? And I'm looking to see, okay, they're trying to break it down of hey, what's really important to flush out with this customer interaction and this customer sort of test I'm going to go do. And ideally, when they're starting those first steps, they're coming up with ideas. They're going to take them an hour to prototype and an hour to get feedback on, right? If they start there, that's a great person, right? Don't get me wrong. Some parts of that problem, later iterations, they're going to be much slower and much more in the weeds and much more involved. But if they tackle every problem that scrappy from the beginning in that iteration, they're very likely to get to a place where when they do have to go to the slower stages of iteration later in the iteration process, they're on the right path at that point. And obviously the worst kind of engineer is someone who where you should be iterating on an hour, it takes them a month. And then of course, it takes them years to get to somewhere elegant and simple.
Yeah. And so it sounds like you're doing sort of the same sort of theoretical problem each time. And so you have an idea of all the possible approaches to iteration in your head. And so then when they suggest something, you can sort of slot it in on
Sometimes it's the same time. Sometimes I'm just looking for them to explain it to me, right? What's their thinking of what's the smartest way to do this? And if they come in and it's just totally bonkers and they can't explain it, I'm that makes me nervous, right? I think as a manager in a technology development process, communication is a big part of what makes the team work, right? And it's another element that you're interviewing for when it comes to speed. And yeah, if they have something that sounds bonkers and they can't explain to you why it's a good idea and why you should at least try, you're not going to have the right person. And that's really important, right? Some of the best engineers in the team at Zipline, they went through this interview with me. We went through this mock problem. Where they wanted to start was not where I would have started, but they explained it to me in a way where I was like, oh, yeah, okay, that's smart. I like that, right? That you're looking for somebody who thinks differently than you in a way that you can collaborate with, because that's, diversity of thought is really important when it comes to, solving problems that haven't been solved before.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Taking a step back, you mentioned that there were literally you say 100 or hundreds of these, chicken prototypes. There's
super chickens.
Yeah. There's, 12 copies of each of these, sort of end iterations of the aircraft. There's, many, many different prototypes you built. Did you ever wonder, or is there any time you can think of where you sort of went too fast or maybe should have spent more time on design phase and then instead sort of built something and kind of shipped it to your test suite kind of prematurely?
All the time. Many examples. Many examples. Part of the point of having a good test suite and having a good test site and having, layers of safety mitigations in your test operations is to give you that latitude, right? If you're not crossing that line, going too fast on a regular basis, then you're probably not close to the line where you should be, if that makes sense, right? You kind of need to step over that line, 20-30% of the time, and then you're at that line. If you're never stepping over that line, which happens a lot in aerospace especially, they're sort of terrified of that line for a lot of reasons. If you're testing a huge aircraft and you crash it, it's a big freaking deal. And part of the reason, we have these tiny drones and they have parachutes on them, so if we have to parachute land one of these during a test, it's not that big a deal. And that's really powerful for speed. So making sure you're kind of testing the line, as my 5-year-old now sort of redefined that term for me of what that means, testing the line. But it's a very similar thing, and it'll drive your test ops folks nuts sometimes, where you're like, hey, we really didn't need to do this. And it's true, you got to learn from that. But at the same time, the goal is not to never cross that line. The goal is to stay on that line where, I don't know, it's 20% over that line. But yeah, there were a lot of times in the early days where the first time we built a custom aircraft, fully custom, that was like designed to go the full range, we built our first prototype of that thing. And on the first flight, we turned it to dust. It was in hindsight, it was just dumb. We were really excited to fly it. We made a test plan that was just a terrible test plan. The joke on this aircraft is we crashed it because we couldn't land it. It flew very well, but we took all the weight out of it because it was like it would fly better. And it flew so well that our test pilot could not get the thing on the ground. And when we got to the edge of our test site in an area that if we crossed, it would have been dangerous. He just had to crash it. And back then we didn't have parachutes. And that was a heartbreaking moment. That was a lot of sweat and tears into that first custom design that was supposed to be able to actually do our full mission, full weight, full range, everything. And first prototype, we had all these test plans planned for the next few weeks, and that was out the window because it was turned into dust.
In the moment, did everyone sort of agree that was a failure, or did you sort of say, look, this iteration speed inherently involves this type of minor tragedy, that's life? Or
what you're getting at is tricky. Is a really tricky aspect of the culture side of this, right? Because you have to learn from every one of these things. Every single time it happens, you got to learn from it. You got to learn the right things. You learn the wrong things from mistakes and go off on tangents you shouldn't go down or make decisions you shouldn't go down. Yeah. At the same time, you got to, it's got to stay positive, right? How many aircraft prototypes did we crash in the first 2 years of testing? A lot. I don't know, dozens probably, and this was a tiny team. There was like 2 technicians building all these things. Some of them were, that was heartbreaking for them. They'd pour, 100 hours of their, sweat and tears into a prototype build. And and then seeing that in a pile of rubble, it was heartbreaking. And so a lot of what we spent time doing was talking before flights. We talked a lot about the risks of flights. So nobody went to a flight being like, oh yeah, this is definitely going to go perfectly. It was like, okay, we think we're at an acceptable risk level. When we have something go wrong, we do a retro and explicitly ask the question of like, hey, how do we need to recalibrate? Right. And there would be debates. I'll give you one example of a debate that stuck in my mind because it reminded me of the kind of conversation you have to have. This person had come from a traditional aerospace company. And at this company that this person came from, they never did test flights on Fridays. That was a policy. And he had been pushing this policy at Zipline.
Wait, sorry. What's like the just quick like reason?
I'm sure they had some crashes on a Friday, and they came to a conclusion that they were rushing to get it done by the end of the week, and that you shouldn't rush to do testing by the end of the week, and that company just made the policy don't fly on Fridays.
Yeah. Okay.
And so this person said this out loud with really passionately of like, hey, we crashed on a Friday. Like, okay, now it's time for Zipline to stop testing on Fridays too. Because, and legitimately it felt like we had rushed that test. Right. And so like the Zipline way to that, which I love, someone on the team, like live in the conversations, like going through a spreadsheet and says, we should not test on Tuesdays because it turns out most of our crashes had been on Tuesdays, not on Fridays. And it was part of the absurdity of it, which is like the lesson that you want people to take there is, take a beat before you test and really make sure you're not rushing to get it out the door by a artificial deadline because then you waste an aircraft. That's the lesson. The lesson isn't don't test on Fridays and making sure that you have enough debate and you have the space to get back to first principles and really come up with the takeaway that's going to be valuable and healthy going forward. Those retros were really powerful. One of the things I've learned to judge a team on is sort of like there are people who are just super positive, and you got to kind of pay attention on any given team. What's the ratio? Like do you have enough super positive people on that team? Do you have enough people who are just going to freaking rally no matter what, right? No matter if you're like, you're tired and it's the middle of the night because you're trying to support something in Africa that's not working. And the whole team is at the test site at 3 a.m. California time, trying to find a way to Rube Goldberg a launcher back together so the Africa team can do it within the next 2 hours so that they can start flying in 3 hours. You got to have enough people who are going to just inject positivity into every one of those experiences to kind of literally kind of carry the tide, carry the boats, right? Provide the energy everybody else needs to really maintain that positive energy and move forward. And I've seen it now where there have been teams and times at Zipline where we didn't have that critical mass of folks with positive energy. Another thing we interview for, which that's actually the easiest thing to interview. I feel like you can just tell at the end of an interview if people like just like what everybody's like, well, that's a super positive person. Those people are super valuable for maintaining that pace. Because yeah, like I said, the one challenge after another is the adventure of something like this. And if you get demoralized, you're done. Yeah.
There was one thing you mentioned over email, chatting about the DAA system.
Detect and avoid is industry jargon for basically an ability for your aircraft to detect where other aircraft are and avoid those aircraft, right? That's what detect and avoid stands for. About 2/3 of aircraft in the US that we encounter with a drone like this, they have a radio transponder. So we just have to listen for that and avoid them. But the other third of aircraft, they don't have a radio transponder. And you literally, like the standard today is what's called see and avoid, which is literally like look out the window of your plane and look for those aircraft and avoid them. Now, this is very hard for a pilot to do. Very hard. The estimates are that about, like practically speaking, if a GA pilot, space small aircraft pilot was on a collision course with another aircraft, only about 50% of the time would they actually avoid that collision. So like, that's not great. The way we operate in Rwanda and Ghana basically is overseen by air traffic controllers there. And it basically doesn't have this problem of aircraft without transponders. So that integration has been very scalable without this technology. We started Zipline. We knew this technology would be needed. I assumed we'd be able to buy this by the time we needed it. Someone would make a solution to this problem. Some sensor
it's just like
package.
a couple of cameras that, yeah.
Exactly. I was assuming this would be available. Over the years, we got to know a bunch of startups and big companies that were doing this. And at a certain point, we started testing some of these things and getting into the details with them as it became clear we were a few years away from needing this. And that's when things got scary. We were testing with some radar companies, and their radars just weren't working. They weren't going to meet the needs of the system. So the challenging part of this from a sensing point of view is that drones don't have right of way. So said another way is that a drone needs to get the heck out of the way of an aircraft. Even if an aircraft's coming up behind you, beside you, below you, wherever it's coming, the drone just needs to get out of the way. And so basically you need to sense with enough range all around you, in order to do that, which is really hard to do. You need to sense basically up about 1 kilometer of range is what you need, if not more, depending if for really fast aircraft you're trying to avoid. Mm-hmm. A lot of companies had assumed the regulators would have right-of-way rules. So if you have a right-of-way rule, then if an aircraft's coming behind you, it has to get out of your way. So you only have to look ahead of you. So they were like, all right, let's put some radar looking ahead. And those radar are so heavy and so expensive and so power consumptive. And they only give you like this little tiny sort of toilet paper roll, view of the world that they just weren't working. And that was a bit scary. We started testing with some of the companies doing this with vision. And vision is really interesting here. Vision has two problems here. One is if you want to see something about 1 kilometer away, if you've ever tried to shoot an airplane with your cell phone, it's very hard to see it. You're talking about like a pixel or two, maybe 3-4 pixels with a really high resolution.
Yeah.
So you have to have a ton of pixels in all directions, and you have to have a ton of compute for all those pixels, and those lenses have to be perfectly clean because one smudge can completely obscure the aircraft. And there's this fun little mathematical proof that basically says that if you are flying flat and level and you're on collision course with something else flying flat and level, that is now the one little pixel group that doesn't move in your aircraft. As you get closer, it gets a little bit bigger, but only a little bit. It goes from 4 pixels to 4.25 pixels to 4.5 pixels, right? It's very hard to detect. And so we're looking at all these drawbacks of cameras and we're like, okay, this is going to be really rough and expensive if it's going to work at all. Because how do you keep that many lenses that clean when you're flying, right? It's dusty, there's rain, all this stuff. So we went back to the drawing board and basically said, all right, we need to kick the tires on this ourselves because we couldn't find, it was just clear this wasn't going to be available as a commercial solution. We were inspired by this solution from World War I, actually. So in World War I, they built these systems, the hearing aids from pre-electronic hearing aids, are basically these little horns you put in your ear. Mm-hmm. So back in World War I, they made giant versions of these that were 20 feet tall that a person would stick their ear to and they could hear aircraft way over the horizon. It's sort of pre-radar if you want to hear an aircraft coming.
Clever.
So it's okay, could we do this with acoustics? Because microphones are great, right? They kind of for free get you 360. They're very light, so they're very low compute load. So if we could figure this out, maybe microphones could work. This started like anything at Zipline. It started as all right, fail fast at this. Let's try to understand the biggest risks here. How can we get to the point where this is never going to work? And there's two really hard problems to this problem. One is they both come down to noise, right? So if you and there's two sources of noise in an aircraft. One is the noise you hear when you lean your head out of a car window, right? It's called aeroacoustic noise. It's just really loud. You pull your head back in, it's quiet. Put your head back out, it's really loud. That aeroacoustic noise is a big challenge, right? And if you've ever seen a movie production, the way they solve that with a microphone is you see this big they call it a dead cat. It's not actually made from a cat, I don't believe, but they call it a dead cat. It's this big hairy thing that you put over a microphone so that to filter that aeroacoustic noise. And obviously it's something you could never put on the outside of an airplane, right? Because rain and dust and like drag, it just, no way. So you have to solve the aeroacoustic noise problem. And we call the own ship noise. So basically you got a propeller right there that's making a ton of noise. How do you hear aircraft a kilometer away when you have, propeller that's like, a foot away to mix units? And so we spent a bunch of time looking at those two problems. And this started with one intern. This was an awesome intern project. To be clear, one of the more brilliant interns you're ever going to meet, but one brilliant intern just looking at these two problems, iterating on the prototyping here. And all of a sudden it was like, ooh, this might actually work, right? Like we actually found some interesting solutions to solve those noise problems. And all of a sudden we were detecting aircraft at about a kilometer away in flight. And we're like, oh yeah, okay. And then we shifted gears from like, okay, fail fast to now that this is possible, what do we think this actually would take to make into a product that we could submit to a regulator with, all this confidence and understanding and certainty. Yeah. And then that slowly scaled up, starting with 2 engineers and then eventually scaling up to submitting this to the FAA this year. It's not approved yet, still going through the approval process, which is very exciting. But yeah, now we have something that actually closes on this very difficult design challenge using an array of microphones on the wing of the aircraft to hear and avoid aircraft.
As that sort of scaled up in number of engineers, how did you decide to scale it up? Like, was it sort of based on like, okay, we have enough work now, given our confidence in this general architecture to like have a couple people explore that in more detail?
Basically, yes. There's a couple inflection points in that curve, right? So at the beginning, there's very concrete problems. I'm a big fan of like, if you can break it down to a concrete problem, ideally it's just one person on the problem, right? On each of those problems. And so that's when we went to 2 people and then eventually to 3 people. Each one of those engineers was, world-class creative problem solver, really independent at the design, iteration, prototyping, and sort of deep engineering understanding of what they're doing as they go. That's how it goes at the beginning until you kind of burn down that big list of open questions. And so after we had this, hey, this could work, it was like, okay, but here's all the reasons it still couldn't work, right? All the waterproofing and manufacturability and signal to noise stuff. And after you solve the noise problem, you need to be able to figure out where the aircraft is coming. Would an array work well enough for that? And so we had this list going and had the smallest team possible working on those problems. Just because small teams, they're just, the collaboration is just amazing, right? There's that value of a really elite team. And then you kind of get to the point where like, okay, now we're going to go for this. And now it's like, okay, let's actually figure out like, what does a production intent version of this hardware look like, this software look like? And that's a big inflection point. Now you need a very different sized team with a pretty different skill set than that initial team. The initial team's still involved on those on those core problems, but that team doesn't know how to, go to a production intent, a microphone design by themselves, as an example, or ship a neural net that like actually like gives you this resolution, right? There's a very big difference between like a prototype neural net and a production ready, validated, fully understood and characterized, like defensible to a regulator neural net. So there was a big inflection there. But it's basically a constant evolution of slowly growing the team. I'm a big fan of like grow slower than you think. Right. It's better to be too small than to be too big. Always. It's better to have an empty seat rather than a hire you shouldn't have made. Always. That serves Zipline well enough that the team loves it. If that makes sense. In the early days, some people were like, what are you doing? Why aren't we hiring this kind of thing? But because the quality of the engineering and more importantly, the quality of the teammates, it's just so much fun to work with a team like that. Yeah. So basically slowly grow and slowly start solving more and more problems. And then you, again, get to that moment where it's like, all right, production intent. What does that team look like? How do we do that as fast as possible? And that's where the team, goes through a pretty big step size.
Yeah. It makes a ton of sense. Have you ever shadowed a teammate and helped them speed something up? And a sort of similar question is like, if you do this often, what's like a common theme that kind of comes up in those conversations?
Yeah, all the time. And I'm always taking the folks who are really good at that, at moving fast and making sure that they give opportunities for people who haven't mastered that. I'd say the theme is reflection, right? And this is one of the things that I train all the new grads at Zipline to do is every single day you have to carve out an hour to reflect, right? Don't do any work, just reflect on what did I learn yesterday. How should that change my plan tomorrow? Am I ready for what I want to do in 2 days in terms of I need to order parts or get ready for that? What have I learned from the last 2 weeks? Like just every day, take that time to reflect on basically how to move faster. How can I iterate more quickly? How can I learn more quickly? Or how do I get to that elegant, simple design I'm proud of? How do I get to that? What's my fastest path to that? And taking that step back is really important for a lot of folks. To me, the seasoned folks are doing this while they're working all the time, right? Constantly. You'll just see it. They'll be working and all of a sudden they'll just be like, wait a minute. Like, okay, new plan, but for until you really have that muscle down, which is hard, right? Especially if you're working on hard things, it can be mentally all consuming, right? If you're working on some really hard analysis or a really tricky to build prototype, like you can't be thinking about other things because you'll hurt yourself if you're building a proto on, or if that analysis just takes all of your brain power. So that's my main advice to people starting out. And once they're confident they're doing it throughout the day, then okay, fine. Let that hour go. But until you're confident you're doing it throughout the day, make sure you create that hour every single day. For most people, it's a pad of paper, thinking this through. How are you planning to do it? How else could you do it? Brainstorm with yourself about your plan of attack going forward. Most people, if they do that, they'll come up with 100 ways to do something better than their idea from yesterday, just based on it's been a day and they have learned something.
Yeah. I love that. And then last question, what's one habit you have personally around moving fast?
I'm inherently impatient. So I have a lot of the things I interview for and sort of inherently, I think my biggest habit is just constantly obsess about the customer and try to make sure that every little decision that I'm making is based there. That can be really, really powerful as you're working on any given problem where it's like, especially as my role as a lead, I've got to make sure the team is obsessed with the right things. Right. And, I've talked about how there's gazillions of things to worry about from a design perspective. And you have to be thinking about those, but you also need to know what is most important. You need to know what is like that thing that matters the most, right? And like we talked about for our platform, right? The early days was range and long range at low cost. That was the most important thing. And there were other things that mattered too. And you couldn't lose sight of all of those, but coming back to those things that mattered most and really using those to drive, like I talked about, start the design with like, what is the simplest solution to that hard problem that matters most to the customer? In that case, range at low cost, and let everything else fall from that. That has served me really well in every project we've been involved in. We really take that time to try to bubble up what really matters the most. And then of course, the way you bubble that up is by spending a lot of time with your customers. Cause you, if you're guessing what matters most, you're wrong most of the time.
Yeah. And so I guess it's sort of like a habit of thought around this type of problem. Like whenever you're thinking about this high level strategy, just like trying to prioritize these and trying to rank these in your mind.
Yeah. And I will say, as we've grown, there's a habit that's kind of like the corollary to something we talked about earlier around making sure the team is connected to the customer, so they're customer obsessed in their thinking. As we've grown, that's harder and harder. And so one of the habits I have now is like just eyes and ears open all the time. Anytime there's an academic debate going on in the engineering team, that is a harbinger of a disconnect to the customer. There's a problem. Go in there, figure out how to get them connected, and make sure that they understand the importance of that connection, using that as a really live example for them of like, hey, you were debating this academic sort of level trade on this design. That's not how we do it at Zipline. You need to ground it in what matters to the customer, if at all possible. And it's almost always possible.
Yeah. In terms of grounding it, you mentioned this one story, like, I don't know, a while ago, where there was a doctor sending you photos of people who had passed away. Did you sort of kind of put those in like I don't know, did you email them out to the company? I mean,
Not initially.
Okay.
Back then we were small and like we started bringing them up in our all hands, not over and over. Cause like, I found that very emotionally hard to deal with. And it was a very tricky tension between, trying to really calibrate to when we're ready to ship this thing. And it was one of those things that we just knew, like if we ship too late, we fail as a company, we fail for our customers. If we ship too early, we fail as a company, we fail for our customers. And that balance, trying to find that, create the safe space for that balance and have the debate for that was tricky. And I want the team to be motivated by what matters to our customers, and that, knowing the customer wanted it that badly was just intrinsic motivation for all of us to like, just come to work with a pep in our step and like, just like really kind of rewind to get through this. But I knew if it went too far, it'd be demoralizing and people would just get stressed out, right? Like, when you hire great people and you're mission oriented like this and you're obsessed with what you're doing, part of the fun of a manager is like, reminding people to take vacations and things because they're so into it. They're not thinking about that at all. And it makes it a lot of fun.
That definitely pushes the other way. Yeah. Cool. Awesome, Kenan. Thanks for coming on the show. Great chatting today.
Yeah, absolutely. It was great speaking with you.